Hi, I'm Nick Molden, and welcome to Molden and Schmidt, the podcast where we try to get to the bottom of the big questions about the future of motoring and, crucially, how we make it more sustainable. I'm the founder and chief executive of Emissions Analytics. We do real world on road testing, and with me is Oliver Schmidt. Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, my name is Oliver Schmidt, and even I don't want to admit it myself, some people would call me a veteran of the automotive industry with more than 25 years. But for most people, unfortunately, I'm known as being part of the Dieselgate.
Well, and that's going to turn out to be relevant today.
Yeah.
What I wanted to cover today was probably the big one on the minds of motorists and policymakers, which is the looming deadline for the ban on internal combustion engines in the UK and Europe in 2035. Why, and is it going to work, and what's the implications of it? Because certainly it's causing a headache right now. It was enacted with the European Green Deal and under Boris Johnson in a flurry of environmental enthusiasm, but the sales of electric vehicles are not keeping up. The sales are growing, but not growing at the rate required to meet that target. And in fact, in the UK, we have an interim target in 2024 that we need to sell 22% of all new vehicles as full electric, but we're running currently at around 15%, and sales are looking soft. Yeah. So increasingly, a headache is forming. So where I would like to start today and get your thoughts is, how come we have got to this situation? Because in my view, this was entirely foreseeable because of the infrastructure and the utility limitations of electric vehicles, but also they're simply their price. So question for you is, why do you think European policymakers have been so aggressive pursuing this goal, which realistically was never practical?
Yeah, as you already said in the beginning, I think this is an aftermath of the Dieselgate, because in 10, 15 years ago, diesel was the way to go on decarbonizing the emissions on public transportation and on personal transportation. And then Dieselgate proved that the diesel on the road was not as clean as everybody thought. So then somehow a switch in the mindset happened, and from there we went immediately to zero carbon, zero emissions, and we go with electric vehicles. And I think that's I wouldn't call it a mistake, but this was the irrational decision that the European Parliament made in 2019, I think, 2020. They made this decision to go all electric only, basically a ban of internal combustion engines in 2035 here in Europe.
I mean, on the surface of it, to defend the policymakers, the electric vehicles are obviously zero CO2, zero carbon dioxide at the tailpipe, and therefore, on paper, these sound like a fantastic way of reducing our transportation CO2. So I get it on that level. But what we found from our work and other people's have shown is that, in fact, the carbon dioxide is only reduced by about 50% on a full life cycle basis with the manufacturing, compared to hybrids, which still have engines, which reduce by about 25 to 30%. So the gain is not so big, and the price increase with electric vehicles is so high. And that's really not changing, except for one thing. And the one thing which is changing now is Chinese electric vehicles coming to Europe, partly due to overproduction in China, but partly strategically China wanting to conquer the European market. So that puts policymakers in a real dilemma. They can have their 2035 ban if they let all these good value Chinese vehicles in, or they can put up tariffs, stop those cars coming in, but then they have to abandon the 2035 ban. Which way do you think it'll fall?
Yeah, but the question, I just respond with a question that I answer myself afterwards, of course. Do you think people will buy these cheap electric vehicles from China? And I personally don't think so. For me, this goes more now in the direction of turning from a vehicle into an appliance. The prices. I just read an article that there will be soon a BYD for 10,000 euros. This for me goes in the way of an appliance, and what confirms for me the theory of turning from vehicle to appliance is that the residual value of electric vehicles is dropping so fast. Uh, More than every internal combustion engine vehicle ever did. So this is where I see the big issue. Next big issue, even if we put all these electric vehicles on the road, we don't have the infrastructure on the electrical grid to charge all these vehicles. It doesn't matter if it's a Tesla, Volkswagen, a Mercedes, or a BYD that doesn't find its charging spots somewhere in a city area where you have skyscrapers.
Absolutely, and the thing that we have been led to believe is that when people have switched to electric, they never go back to internal combustion engines. More than 95% of people stick with electric. That's the current prevailing belief that I would actually challenge as these electric vehicles move into the mass market. My opinion is that people initially will buy these cheaper Chinese vehicles. There is quite a lot of pent up interest and demand in electric vehicles. And when you're offered something at 10, 15,000 euros, there will be a chunk of the market that will try it out. The question then will be, though, will that fulfill what people need? Will they be satisfied? And will they stick with electric vehicles the next time around? So I think we'll find midway into this transition that there may well be a softening and some return back to particularly to hybrids, rather than an exponential growth rapidly towards this 2035 goal. So there's immediate pressures, but even if governments get past these immediate pressures through Chinese vehicles and subsidies, there will be many tailwinds potentially ahead, as these vehicles may not fulfill the needs. But there could be technological progress. Do you see technological progress potentially bailing this out, and these EVs become so fantastic
Yeah,
that they become irresistible?
the question is how you define the technical development or technical improvement in this electric vehicles. I think it doesn't matter at the moment which electrical vehicle you take, they all drive fine. It's not like in the past, in the 60s and 70s, when you had some really shitty cars on the road that didn't behave proper. I think all those cars drive pretty fine. It doesn't matter if you drive a Geely, a Smart, or whatever it's called. The big trend in those vehicles, especially in the vehicles coming from China, are all the electrical gadgets. So we know that, for example, they have combined their ventilation system to the entertainment system. And if you watch a movie where there is a storm, somehow your blower in your ventilation cranks up, and you get a headwind that you feel because that's what's happening in the movies. Those gadgets is what's driving the trend, especially in China. That's one of the hard findings that most of the European manufacturers had to make in China, that the Chinese people don't care that much for the exterior and everything. They care for these gadgets. And I think this is a trend that we will see here soon too, that those cars get preferred because they have all these gadgets.
And how many years behind or months behind are European manufacturers compared to their Chinese rivals? So when these cars arrive, how uncompetitive or competitive is the European industry as it stands?
As we know, a software development cycle, I would say if you're fast, if you're good, is 24 months. So I would say so if you look at your car now and you say I want to be competitive, then you achieve the level of what they have now in about 24 months. But the question is how have they progressed? What's the new hot stuff? What's the new funny new gadget that you need to implement? And then you're always behind. You will always be behind trying to chase it. You might catch up a little bit, but the advantage is always there. And then the next thing is just the amount of engineers the Chinese manufacturers can throw at solving these issues. How many programmers do they have? It's
Yeah.
incredible the amount of people that they have to basically fulfill the customer demands. Where we know from, if you look in the in newspaper or LinkedIn, Stepstone, whatever, how big the demand for especially experienced software developers is here in the European Union and Great Britain.
And do you see any of the European manufacturers, let's assume they could be competitive on functionality, but are any of the European manufacturers close on price competitiveness to China?
This is a very difficult one because you can't compare price competitiveness with China, because Chinese vehicles, like a lot of things of China, are heavily subsidized. So this is something I would not dare to compare. But the question is, I haven't had a look at the lower price point Chinese vehicles yet, like the new BYDs. I recently looked at a Volvo, which is a Geely. This car is executed pretty nice. The new small Volvo that is the same as the smart #1. This car is executed pretty nice, so that's not where they are lacking. So I would say the price point might be a question of subsidies. We've seen it. As soon as the subsidies went away in Germany for electric vehicles, the sales basically dropped by 50%.
Yes, well, and there's certainly calls for reintroducing subsidies, but the big thing being talked about at the moment is whether Europe will raise raise tariffs
Yeah,
on these Chinese vehicles to try and protect or give the European industry some time to adapt. It will be, I think, July is when we're expected to see the outcome of
yeah.
that. But I wanted to bring
But
us back to Dieselgate.
let me
Yeah,
ask you one
please go.
question first. Do you really think there will be
Sure.
tariffs?
I think there will have to be tariffs. I think they will probably try and dress it up in as palatable a way as possible.
Yeah,
Don't forget, there's also tariffs. There's also quotas. There's also all sorts of non-tariff barriers. So I'm not saying necessarily it'll be tariffs in the classic, straightforward
mm,
sense of tariffs per unit tax, but there may be all sorts of the less conspicuous
mm,
uh, trade barriers. But we have to see this in the context of Europe very much relies upon Chinese investment generally
yeah,
to fund our deficits.
correct.
And so China has a very strong negotiating position in this. The end game, I think, will end up is what happened to the British motor industry in the 80s, which was in the end the European industry gets progressively bought up by the Chinese.
Yeah,
So the cars are made in
yeah,
Europe,
yeah,
but are largely by Chinese owned operations. And politicians in Europe will sell that as we've still got a domestic auto industry, but
correct.
in reality, it'll be largely foreign owned. Do you think that's a credible scenario?
Yeah, you're 100% correct. So we've seen Volvo is already owned by a Chinese company. We see a high percentage already in Mercedes-Benz, or Mercedes cars as they are called now. So we already see this, that foreign investors are buying into the European auto manufacturers, especially the German ones. You might have some brands that are protected. I doubt that the Quant family is giving away any of their shares from BMW. I doubt that the German or the government of Lower Saxony, which is a shareholder of Volkswagen, will allow Volkswagen to partner or to be bought up by a Chinese investor. But if you reverse it, Volkswagen was successful in China because they have the two joint ventures. And in these joint ventures, they are already owned by 50% plus one by the Chinese manufacturers. So this is the next thing. If you want to do business in China, you're already forced into partnerships, joint ventures, whatever, or they have these tariffs on vehicles with huge displacement. So there are already import tariffs into China. The question is what I see critical is the industry still relies a lot of exports to China. especially our metal industry here in Germany still relies on those exports. And the question is, what happens if we, even if they are visible tariffs, if they are hidden tariffs, if they are whatever tariffs, what happens on the Chinese side to all our exports here? That's where I see the big difficulty.
Yeah. So which sort of brings us back round and to sort of round off for today. This is clearly a topic which is going to run, but for the purposes of today, I wanted to bring back to where we started in the question of Dieselgate, because these trends that you've described are quite clear. But yet, at the moment, at least, policymakers are sticking doggedly to this 2035 ban, and they're under a lot of pressure from environmental NGOs to not water this down. Why do you think that there is such a dogged adherence to this? One theory I'd put out there, maybe slightly controversial, and I'm not saying necessarily that I agree with, but is that it comes back to Dieselgate, and it comes back to the very little consequence has come to the European industry as a result of Dieselgate in terms of fines and punishments, legal determinations, unlike what happened in the US. So is there part of the policymaker space which sees it that the industry has brought this on it themselves, that they deserve this pain? This is the just punishment for Dieselgate, and they will be left to suffer for a lot longer. But is there anything in that, in your view?
Yeah, this is a way to see it. You're right. So basically, that you say that the punishment in the US for Dieselgate was on the financial side, and on in Europe it's on the product side. So that's basically short what you just said. So that the punishment didn't just take place in fines and stuff like this, but that it takes place in just taking away the product. So
policymakers may let the industry suffer for longer before it maybe gives us an exit route at the last minute.
I doubt that there will be I think they would lose too much faith if they give an exit route in the last minute. The issue would be that then they really lose faith. If there will be an exit strategy, I think we will see this soon. That for example, stuff like e-fuels, like HVO, that things like this will get incorporated into a way of zero emission transportation, which not is 100% electric vehicles. In my eyes, this will be the way that we will see in the near future, that there will be more and more exceptions from the rule, and that these exceptions will then water down the decision.
Well, we'll end there, but I would say I probably agree with you on that. That tends to be the European way of doing things, that the glamorous headlines of a ban or some other great policy tend to remain, but it's reconciled with reality by watering it down behind the scenes in the detail to make it something that's actually doable. So we may still have the 2035 ban, but it may not have the teeth that it currently does. So I'm sure we will revisit this again. Thank you for your comments today, and thank you for listening to Molden and Schmidt. My name is Nick Molden from Emissions Analytics. Thank you, Oliver. Have you any last comments you'd like to make?
No, I'm fine with what we just said, and I guess we will come back to this topic.
We will. On that note, thank you very much, and goodbye.